We'd like to thank the Culture Consortium and the National Child Traumatic Stress Network for organizing this Culture and Trauma Speaker Series and for inviting us to make this presentation. And we'd like to begin by acknowledging Dr. Nicole Tefera of the Chicago Child Trauma Center, who, while she is not speaking today, has contributed tremendously to the content of and ideas reflected in our talk. We also, We also want to acknowledge our colleagues in the NCTSN Race and Urban Poverty Work Group who have contributed to the content of today's talk in a variety of ways through discussions, reviews of literature, and their writing. We need to also make a disclaimer on their behalf. While our work together has taught us much and helped to shape our thinking, the views we are expressing are ours, and it should not be assumed that they are shared in their entirety by all the contributors. Next slide. So what we're going to be talking about over the next hour is initially talking about the concept of race, reviewing some of the statistics on trauma exposure in Black urban children, and then talking specifically about the children served by the Chicago Child Trauma Center, and talk about individual traumatization and the services that we provide at the Chicago Child Trauma Center, talk about the context and societal traumatization and the legacy of slavery. Our topic today is one that is extremely complicated, has a long multi-generational history, and is fraught with emotion. We're not going to try to offer answers or suggestions about how people should practice, but rather to suggest that our practice as trauma professionals needs to include thoughtful attention to the facts and ideas we'll be discussing and to the issues raised by them. We feel that we've just begun the process ourselves of thinking about and attempting to address some of the issues we'll discuss today. We don't have answers. It is our intention to share where we are in our thinking about these issues in order to spur dialogue out of which answers or ideas might emerge for all of us. Although this talk is part of the Culture and Trauma Speaker Series, we will not be talking about culture in the sense of a particular cultural group or ethnic minority culture. If we are talking about a culture, it is the culture of the United States of America. We will be talking about Black children and families who can come from varied cultural backgrounds. What they share is less about a particular set of beliefs, traditions, or group practices than that they are all subject to racial classification as Black or African American. This, as we will be discussing, carries with it a heavy price. Next slide.
Arabia Children's Hospital is located in one of the most racially and economically segregated areas in the United States, and the primary mission of the Chicago Child Trauma Center is to make expert trauma-focused services available to Black families living in economically distressed urban communities. Over the last few years, children and families served by the Chicago Child Trauma Center have been 80 to 90% Black, with the majority dependent on Medicaid for their health care. Given the strong and persistent correlation between racial classification and socioeconomic status, one cannot talk about the challenges facing urban Black families without talking about poverty. Our focus on urban Black children and families should in no way be understood as diminishing or minimizing the importance of issues related to racism and poverty for members of other racial classification groups or ethnic minorities. But our talk today and the work of the Race and Urban Poverty Work Group are limited to the experience of serving Black urban children and families. While racism and poverty affect members of many groups, the interaction of race, poverty, and racial and economic segregation creates a unique set of challenges for urban Black families and service providers in urban settings. People frequently ask why we put quotation marks around the word race. The quotation marks are intended to indicate our understanding that there is no such thing. The American Anthropological Association in 1994 issued a resolution stating that differentiating species into biologically defined races has proven meaningless and unscientific. Statistically, the amount of genetic variation within a given group of people is greater than the amount of genetic variation between groups. There is ample evidence that race is a scientific and biological fallacy, yet members of the human race continue to pretend that it exists for social and political reasons, especially when distinguishing white from black. Within the mental health field, in many settings, by convention, a client's racial classification is one of the first pieces of information to appear in a written report. Next slide. As Angela James and Joseph Grace Jr. and many other authors have pointed out, despite its biological non-existence, the concept of race is a pervasive and powerful one with major social and political ramifications. While race is a dynamic phenomenon rooted in political struggle, it is commonly considered a fixed characteristic of human populations. While it does not exist in terms of human biology, people routinely look to the human body for evidence about racial identity. While it is a biological fiction, it is nonetheless a social fact. The traditional concept of race as a biological fact is a myth. Most Americans still believe in the concept of race the way they believe in the law of gravity. They believe in it without even knowing what it is they believe in. Having said all that, we are now going to do the very thing that we have just identified as a major intellectual problem. That is, we're going to label a group of people and talk about what research tells us about the kinds of experiences they are likely to have as compared to people to whom we apply other labels. Black urban children are at extremely high risk for exposure to Criterion A PTSD traumatic stressors. No matter what Criterion A stressor you look at, this is consistently the case. Next slide. The Chicago Child Trauma Center came into existence because of the very high rate of trauma exposure among urban black children. The children we serve are much more likely than their white counterparts to experience loss and violent death, or to be victims of or witnesses to violent crime. Black Americans are 281% more likely to be victims of homicide than their white counterparts. One study of urban black adolescents found that nearly half had witnessed a homicide and over a third had been threatened with a gun. Next slide. Another study found that urban black children had extremely high rates of witnessing violent crime. In a 2005 report, the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority concluded that being black, living in a city, and having an annual family income under $10,000 placed individuals at increased risk for criminal victimization. Next slide. Even closer to home, while the population of the city of Chicago is about 35% black and 35% white, according to Chicago Police Department statistics, 61.5% of victims of violent crime in the city in 2003 were black, as compared to 17% white and 19% Hispanic. In a groundbreaking study in 1993, Carl Bell and Esther Jenkins found that 75% of elementary school children on the south side of Chicago had witnessed a robbery, shooting, stabbing, or killing. Next slide. For domestic violence, statistics reflect similar increased risks for black urban children. Next slide. This is also true for residential fire, fire deaths, and burns. Next slide. Finally, according to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services statistics, African American children have double the rate of reported maltreatment of white or Hispanic children. In our own backyard, 25% of Illinois' foster children reside in the area served by the Chicago Child Trauma Center. Clearly, urban black kids are much more likely than others to experience a wide variety of traumatic stressors, which is why the Chicago Child Trauma Center was created. Now I'm going to hand it back to Brad to talk about how we have gone about trying to meet the needs of black children in the Chicago area that have experienced trauma, children we serve, and the work that we do. Next slide.
As June mentioned, given the high risk for exposure to all types of traumatic stress among children residing in the areas we serve, there is a great need for trauma-focused assessment and therapy. Despite doing virtually no outreach to get referrals, we consistently have more children referred for services than we can handle, and children frequently wait for services. Our program only serves children who have experienced a Criterion A PTSD potentially traumatic event, and we're going to now briefly describe what trauma exposure looked like among the children served last year. Next slide. Over 1/3 of children served last year had experienced 2 or more types of Criterion A stressors. This graph doesn't reflect numbers of traumatic events experienced, just types of stressors. In other words, the 2/3 of children who experienced one type of Criterion A stressor includes children who experienced, for example, one episode medical trauma or abuse. And it also includes children with histories of chronic sexual abuse and children who witnessed multiple episodes of domestic violence, for example. These data also underestimate the level of trauma exposure, as they primarily reflect information about indexed traumas at the time of referral to our program. As we get to know our clients, however, we frequently learn of additional traumatic stressors that we did not hear about initially because they were not what brought them to us, or because they experienced them as part of the background of their lives and don't think to tell us about them. Examples include one family that came to us as a medical trauma case following an accident in which one of the girls' back was broken. We soon learned that the history of the family also includes domestic violence and sexual abuse. One way that we learn about additional trauma exposure is through an intervention we learned from Laurel Kaiser and our new NCTSN partners at the University of Maryland, in which safety maps of the family's home, school, and neighborhood are drawn. This approach has proven more effective than our direct questioning about exposure, such as with the UCLA Reaction Index for PTSD, which we also use, in prompting families to remember things that they did not think to tell us about initially. It also gives us information about traumatic stressors experienced vicariously rather than directly by our clients, which occurred in their surroundings and of which they are aware. Although these kinds of events do not tend to cause PTSD in our clients, they frequently act as triggers and need to be addressed in stabilizing symptoms and establishing a realistic sense of safety. For example, when one of the girls in the family I just mentioned was working on her safety map, she talked about the high level of gang activity at the high school across the street from her school, and also mentioned that up the street from that high school was a home in which 2 boys were murdered by their mother's boyfriends. The data in the graph also underestimate trauma exposure for the nearly 40% of children served who had histories of placement in foster or substitute care. Historical information about the early childhoods of those children is often very difficult to obtain, as neither they nor their caregivers may actually know what they've experienced. Next slide. Because our program includes the Children's Advocacy Center and also serves as a primary treatment provider for the Chicago Children's Advocacy Center, sexual abuse or sexual assault is the most frequently occurring traumatic stressor among the children we serve. But we see children who've experienced just about every type of horrible thing you can think of. Next slide. I used to say that we saw every type of traumatic stress other than natural disaster and war. That was before Hurricane Katrina. We also have had numerous children endorse the war item on the reaction index in reference to gang or drug-related violence that they've witnessed. Next slide. The services we provide are all trauma-focused and are based on some assumptions about the effects of psychological trauma, which, in our experience, hold true in the children we see, regardless of their background or socioeconomic status. These assumptions are that traumatic experiences are those which overwhelm an individual's capacity to integrate experience in the normal way. Following exposure to trauma, if integration does not occur, traumatic experiences are then split off, and an individual alternates between functioning as if the trauma is still occurring and functioning as if the trauma never occurred. Then, although traumatic memories and associations remain inaccessible to consciousness, much of the time, they have the power to shape an individual's daily functioning and behavior. This is slide 18, by the way. So the interventions that we provide are based on these assumptions, and they're consistent with current knowledge and theory about the effects of trauma on children and about evidence-based intervention. There's been a lot of attention within our network to trying to identify the core components of effective trauma-focused treatment. In our view, the core of trauma-focused therapy involves integration of traumatic experience. Next slide. So that's the core of the intervention, integration of traumatic experience. And other core components include establishing safety, addressing histories of attachment disorganization, disruption, or loss, trauma narratives, integration of aspects of the child's personality, self, or experience that have been split off, and then educating the child's caregivers about symptoms and their meaning, working with family, school, and others in the child's life to support the child's progress and adapt to changes as the child heals. While we could easily double the capacity of our program and still not be able to meet the demand for services if somebody gives a whole bunch of money, more money, we've been generally successful in making services available to children that need them and in applying our medical model to treat trauma-related injuries at the individual level. Our experience has been that it doesn't matter what group a child belongs to, the individual response to trauma appears to be universal. This, combined with the remarkable resiliency of the children we serve, makes our job a relatively easy one. Kids come to us after they've been hurt, and we help them to feel better and to move on from the trauma, and their symptoms go away. Next slide. So we've been fairly successful reaching the children that need our services and applying our medical model intervention. Some of the keys to our success include the fact that we do not have fees for our services. We provide transportation assistance in the form of passes for public transportation. That we're not connected to a mental health agency, so as a result, children are not usually referred to us because somebody thinks that there's something wrong with them or that they're crazy. They come because they've experienced something horrible. We do not approach our work in terms of pathology or deficits in skills or knowledge in our clients, but rather from the assumption that their trauma-related distress represents normal responses to abnormal or horrible situations. Additionally, we have a demonstrated commitment to providing high-quality, effective services and a highly qualified, integrated professional team. It also helps that we provide services in multiple locations, including easily accessible locations in the communities we serve. Next slide. Despite our clinical successes at the individual level, we continue to be confronted by the context in which so many of the children we serve are allowed to experience such a high level of trauma exposure. And we often feel like they and we are up against forces much more powerful than anything we can affect in our work with our nice little medical model. The more we learn to understand the experiences of the families we serve and how to provide effective services to them, the more we see that our work needs somehow also to address the larger context. Now I'm going to turn it back over to June to talk about that context. Next slide.
So our services are all about Criterion A stressors. That's what all the kids we see share and what brings them to us. And we tend to think of them in terms of the particular trauma or traumas they've experienced at the individual level. As we've said, we don't think of them as black traumatized kids or white traumatized kids or Hispanic traumatized kids. When we think of the children and families we serve, however, not just as traumatized children, but in the context of as black Americans, we are aware that Criterion A traumatic stressors are just one of the many stressors they cope with on a daily basis. Criterion A stressors are experienced by individuals situated in families and communities and in historical contexts. For black Americans, this includes the massive historical trauma of slavery, individual, cultural, and institutional racism. We'd like to spend a little bit of time briefly reviewing some of the vast literature in this context, including racism and its effects. Next slide. Examples of some of the stressors associated with being black in America that we will be discussing include unemployment, poverty, race-based stressors, microaggressions, invisibility syndrome, role strain, disproportional incarceration rates, health disparities, education disparities, and residential segregation. These can generally be viewed as fitting into one of three categories: individual racism, cultural racism, and institutional or institutionalized racism. I'm going to briefly discuss some of the manifestations of each of these forms of racism. Although we're not going to spend a lot of time on racism at the individual level, the clinical importance of being aware of and understanding individual racism cannot be overstated, especially our need to be aware of our own internalized, unconscious racial beliefs and attitudes so that they do not interfere with our work or harm our clients. A lot of excellent work has been done on racism and clinical work, including most recently by our NCTSN colleagues at the Jewish Board of Family and Children's Services in New York. We refer you also to the work of our neighbors Carl Bell and the Community Mental Health Council, and most especially to the extensive work of A.J. Franklin and Nancy Boyd Franklin. Next slide. Individual racism refers to both intentional and unintentional acts of discrimination that individuals exert on others who are not members of their racial group. Individual racism includes acts that reflect the belief in cultural, emotional, intellectual, social, and moral superiority of white individuals. Some examples include overt race-based stressors, microaggressions, and invisibility syndrome. In terms of overt and obvious acts of individual racism or race-based stressors, at the extreme end of the spectrum, our clients include a boy who was held underwater and nearly drowned by a white man who reportedly did not think that boy should be swimming in the same pool as his daughter. This boy, in addition to the emotional post-traumatic effects of this incident, also now suffers from significant cognitive impairments resulting from his traumatic brain injury. This kind of event, however, is not typical of the experience of most of our families. For most of the children and families we serve, the stress of racism at the individual level is more about the subtle day-to-day insults associated with the assumptions and biases that are acted out when one is seen as a member of a certain racial group and not as an individual human being. Next slide. The work of A.J. Franklin and Nancy Boyd Franklin has been extremely helpful to us in shaping our thinking about clinical work with black families. Regarding the more subtle forms of individual racism, they have written, cumulative experiences of confronting race-related stress, emotional abuse, and the psychological trauma of racism can lead to the development of the invisibility syndrome. Symptoms of this syndrome are an outcome of psychological conditions produced when a person perceives that his or her talents, and identity are not seen because of the dominance of preconceived attitudes and stereotypes. Persons of color experience this as a slight or microaggression. Microaggressions, therefore, are acts of disregarding the person of color based on biased beliefs. While we do not want to minimize in any way the importance of attending to racism at the individual level, we are aware that focusing on individual racist attitudes, whether conscious or unconscious, has the potential to distract us from the broader manifestations of racism at the societal level, which in many ways may have much more power in shaping the lives of our clients. Next slide. Cultural racism occurs when white cultural phenomena and values such as art, music, religion, standards of beauty are perceived and are held as standards and cultural norms for people of color. Cultural practices and norms that differ from those of whites are minimized, erased, distorted, dismissed as fads, or pathologized. This idea of cultural racism reflects the reality that the culture of America is a white culture. It takes a lot of energy, therefore, to be successful, to develop an identity, to fit in if you're not white or perceived to be white. The energy involved in functioning in white American culture for non-whites has been described as role strain. Next slide. People can feel role strain when they fail to adequately meet social expectations or experience conflict between their cultural values and the values of mainstream society. When individuals compromise their cultural role demands in order to achieve within mainstream society, consequences can result in rejection and isolation from family and friends. Many black individuals are stuck with a major dilemma in which they are trying to exist simultaneously in two different worlds and not feeling truly accepted in either. Some black individuals may be perceived as acting white or trying to be white, or conversely, may be criticized by whites for being too black or playing the race card. One need only look at the current campaign for the Democratic presidential nomination to see this dynamic at work. While both individual and cultural racism clearly have effects on individuals that experience them, the forces that we often feel most helpless to affect in our work have more to do with the institutionalized racism that pervades the structure of our society. Next slide. Institutional racism is characterized by an organized network such as an educational system, business, or healthcare system that enacts normative practices that disadvantage others based on their racial or ethnic group membership. Some general examples of present-day institutional racism against African Americans include housing discrimination, residential segregation, healthcare treatment inequities, policy practices such as racial profiling. Next slide. Although most black Americans do not live in poverty, poverty rates are disproportionately high for blacks, especially in urban areas. A recent study of 100 U.S. cities found that in the vast majority of major metropolitan areas, 10% or fewer white families with children live in poverty. In sharp contrast, in three-fourths of cities studied, poverty rates for black families were greater than 20%. Similarly, in most major metropolitan areas, more than 70% of white families with children own their homes as compared to home ownership rates of black families, which are 50% or less in almost all cities. Next slide. These statistics from the same study show the drastic socioeconomic racial differences for children in Chicago. Poverty and segregation, of course, have major implications for the educational resources and opportunities available to children, as funding for public schools is tied to property taxes. Thus, many of the children we serve attend segregated public schools with minimal resources, huge student-teacher ratios, and poor academic track records. The experience of one 6-year-old boy served by our program provides a dramatic illustration of the interaction of poverty, segregation, educational disparities, and other types of institutional racism. This little boy, whose trauma history included a burn, witnessing extensive domestic violence, and sexual abuse, attended a Chicago public school which, despite being situated in a middle-class, racially integrated neighborhood, had an enrollment of 86% black, 3% Hispanic, and 3% white children, with 71.5% of children coming from low-income families. The kindergarten class had 36 children and 2 teachers. Due to the school's zero-tolerance violence policy, after an incident in which this little boy became aggressive and injured his teacher's hand, he was arrested by the Chicago Police Department. Next slide. This slide depicts just a few of the major racial disparities in health and access to health care. Black infants are nearly 2.5 times more likely than white infants to die before their first birthday. Nearly 70% of black adults are overweight. Nationally, half of all black neighborhoods lack access to a full-service grocery store or supermarket. African Americans with diabetes have a 27% higher death rate than whites with this disease. There are a myriad of health problems for which blacks are less likely to receive treatment and from which they are more likely to die than their white counterparts. Factors which contribute to this are not limited to unavailability of health care or poor quality of available services, but also include a healthy distrust of the healthcare system on the part of many blacks, not unwarranted in a country whose public health service produced the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male from 1932 to 1972. Disparities in health care also include, of course, mental health services. Given the high levels of trauma exposure for black Americans, the scarcity of treatment services, and the fact that many black individuals are unlikely to seek mental health services due to healthy suspicion as well as stigma, it's not surprising that many of the children we serve have caregivers with trauma histories and untreated trauma-related symptoms. As an example, one child served at the Chicago Child Trauma Center, whose father murdered her mother, lives with a grandmother with an extensive domestic violence history of her own. Her grandmother's trauma symptoms often make it difficult for her to participate in this child's treatment. Next slide. There is a huge body of literature documenting the racial disproportionality of the criminal justice system. Again, these are just a few of the statistics that illustrate how this disproportionality affects black children. At current incarceration rates, 32% of black males will enter federal or state prison during their lifetime, as compared to 17% of Latino males and 5.9% of white males. On any given day, 1 of every 14 black children has a parent in prison. Given current incarceration rates, it is extremely unlikely that children served by the Chicago Child Trauma Center would not have a member of their extended family who is or who has been in prison. This reality has very real implications for these children when it comes to their beliefs about themselves and the world. One 12-year-old client came in the other day and informed her therapist that her 18-year-old cousin was back in jail. When asked how she made sense of this, she said, "Black men don't try hard enough." Another child, whose mother's boyfriend murdered her siblings and whose biological father is incarcerated for a violent crime, said that she did not want to go to a black school because black people are violent. course, all the schools to which he has access have 100% black student population. Any act of violence that occurs in her environment will be committed by black people. She is aware of horrific violence done by white people because she is a big wrestling fan and knows the story of wrestler Chris Benoit, who murdered his wife and son and killed himself. She did not conclude from this incident, however, that white people are violent. Her beliefs, derived from her personal experience and based on the violent behavior of a small minority of people in her community, are very difficult to challenge, as she will not have the opportunity to directly experience or witness violence done by members of other groups, and because her attitudes have been shaped by mainstream stereotypes about blacks, which are prevalent in popular culture in every medium. Next slide. The child welfare system, with which many of us are intimately involved, is also characterized by institutional racism. Blacks make up 15% of the general U.S. population, yet 42% of children in foster care in the United States are black. In Chicago, where blacks make up 35% of the general population, 95% of children placed in foster care are black. And in New York City, 73% of children placed in foster care are black, while 3% are white. Black children are clearly overrepresented in the child welfare system, which is supposed to be there to protect them. Removal of children from their families, however, frequently does not serve this goal. Among the children served at the Chicago Child Trauma Center, there are many who were removed from their biological families due to neglect or drug exposure in utero and placed in foster homes in which they then experienced sexual abuse, physical abuse, or torture. We've talked about the context in which the children we serve experience traumatic events and the individual, cultural, and institutional racism that shape their experience. The statistics related to various forms of institutionalized racism, including poverty, segregation, educational and health disparities, incarceration rates, and disproportional placement in foster care, paint a picture of two Americas, separate and unequal. Notwithstanding the abolition of slavery through the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865 and the achievements of the civil rights movement in the last century, the rates at which black people are placed in the custody of the state, whether in prison or foster care, reflect major disparities in the degree to which Americans in different racial categories might be considered free. Next slide.
As June has discussed at some length, the current state of America is characterized by racial divisions and inequalities that have persisted since the time of slavery. We believe that the massive historical trauma of slavery has had pervasive effects on our society that shape our society's structures and our daily existence. Anyone who has watched the news in the last week has been confronted with evidence of these divisions and the painful and vehement emotions that accompany centuries-old wounds. In working to understand the context in which the children we serve have been traumatized, we have become convinced of the need to address our collective traumatic history head-on. As we know, like talking about any trauma, this is not an easy task. Next slide. In his recent essay, American Slavery in History and Memory, Ira Berlin writes that while slavery serves as an entry point for a dialogue on race, it also carries with it deep anger, resentment, indignation, and bitterness for some, and embarrassment, humiliation, and shame for others, along with large drafts of denial, sometimes through evasion or silence. So we realize that it's very difficult and painful for people to talk about slavery, but we've come to the conclusion that it's extremely important. Urban black families face a unique set of adversities and stressors. The massive historical trauma of slavery has never been addressed, yet creates the context in which present traumas occur and are dealt with. Those of us working with children and families whose daily existence is shaped by the legacy of slavery and racial injustice cannot optimally treat trauma-related distress if we fail to understand and address the effects of the trauma of the past. Next slide. This is slide number 37. The era of slavery wounded African Americans and has had profound multi-generational consequences. Enslavement had an impact on the physical, cultural, spiritual, and mental experience of its victims as well. Estimates of those who died during slavery, including those lost in crossing the ocean, range from 25 million to over 100 million. The enormity of slavery, the number of people who were killed, and the atrocities that took place during and since slavery are overwhelming. In the field of trauma, there's been a great deal of attention and research into the multi-generational effects of trauma. Most of this research has looked at survivors of the Holocaust and their offspring. Yet, in America, we have failed to take a similar interest in the massive historical trauma that occurred in our own home, even though the numbers killed in the Holocaust pale in comparison to those killed during slavery. Next slide. So, here's where we are. Race does not exist at a biological level. Most laws supporting racial discrimination in the United States have been abolished. Most Americans can honestly say that they don't harbor white supremacist beliefs. More black Americans have reached higher levels of fame and economic success than ever before. Nonetheless, when one examines the statistics and current events, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that nearly the same level of segregation, inequality, and oppression exists today as did 150 years ago. Next slide. I want to return to the basic assumptions about psychological traumatization that we talked about earlier today. Traumatic experiences are those which overwhelm an individual's capacity to integrate experience in the normal way. Following exposure to trauma, if integration does not occur, traumatic experiences are split off, and an individual alternates between functioning as if the trauma is still occurring and functioning as if the trauma never occurred. Although traumatic memories and associations remain inaccessible to consciousness much of the time, they have the power to shape an individual's daily functioning and behavior. The persistence of the concept of race and the racial divisions and inequalities that exist in our culture have many causes. One of those causes is our failure to address and integrate the traumatic past and to understand its connections to our present. The fact that a small number of black Americans have achieved economic success is often used to support the idea that things have changed and that this trauma is in the past. We would never use this kind of logic in assessing our clients. It is like saying that because a child sleeps through the night once a month without having nightmares, he doesn't have PTSD. Next slide. Just as in cases of individual traumatization, avoidance of acknowledging and addressing the traumatic past makes it impossible for integration to occur. As long as slavery remains taboo, the racial divisions that pervade every aspect of American life will persist. Next slide. As trauma professionals, we specialize in helping people to communicate about and understand that which cannot be spoken so that they can overcome the horrific past and live in the present. Our task in working with traumatized black children and their families is to augment our medical model, evidence-based individual approaches to therapy by developing ways of addressing slavery and its legacy in our work.